"You're late again, Elise." Blake's words were measured, but they carried the weight of concern, frustration, and an edge of suspicion. He didn't look up as Elise entered, his eyes fixed on the cold coffee in his hand. The clock on the wall chimed 10. Elise paused, just for a moment, keys slipping through her fingers with a faint jingle as they hit the granite countertop. She forced a smile, one that never touched her eyes. "Work's been hectic, Blake." Her voice was too even. She slipped out of her heels, the usual rhythmic tapping of her shoes on the tiles missing, replaced by hesitant silence. Blake glanced at her bag, the strap frayed from overuse, a small detail, but it struck him now. She tossed it onto the sofa, too forcefully, almost as if trying to rid herself of a burden. He nodded slowly, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Big client deal?" he repeated, his tone neither accusing nor entirely believing. "Yeah, big deal." She nodded quickly, pulling off her jacket with hurried movements. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons as if they, too, were betraying her. "It'll be wrapped up soon. Just a couple more late nights." Silence hung between them, stretched tight like a frayed rope. Blake could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Elise moved towards the hallway, eager to escape, but he stopped her with a question, pointed but casual. "Which client?" She turned, just slightly, but didn't meet his gaze. "You don't know them?" Her words came too fast. She forced a laugh that echoed hollowly through the room. "It's all boring financial stuff. You wouldn't care." He nodded again slowly. "Right? Boring." Elise turned on her heel and hurried into the bathroom. The door closed with a soft click, followed moments later by the rush of water. Blake exhaled a long, heavy breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stood, his legs stiff, and walked to the window. The night was dark, the streetlights casting a pale glow over their quiet suburban neighborhood. Everything seemed ordinary, but nothing felt that way anymore. Blake's fingers moved almost mechanically as he tidied the living room, folding the throw blanket, straightening the magazines, lining up the remotes. He used to love these little habits, small acts that made their house a home. Now, each gesture felt meaningless. He walked over to Elise's bag, his chest tightening as he stared at it. He hesitated, then reached inside. Just as quickly, he withdrew his hand, guilt and self-loathing twisting in his gut. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, scrubbing a hand over his face. "I'm acting paranoid." But was he? The late nights, the vague excuses, the distance that had grown between them like a wall. Was he just imagining it? He wanted to believe he was overthinking. He wanted to trust her. He wanted to be wrong. Blake turned back to the bathroom door. The water still ran. He could picture her standing under the hot spray, washing away the day, or whatever she wanted to forget. He clenched his jaw. He needed to clear his head. The next morning, the routine resumed, almost painfully normal. Blake made coffee, and the smell filled the kitchen. Elise walked in, wearing a blue blouse he'd always liked. She kissed him on the cheek, as if nothing had changed. "Morning," she said, reaching for a mug. "Morning," he replied, watching her closely. She poured coffee, her movements practiced, her expression unreadable. "Do you have meetings today?" he asked casually, stirring sugar into his cup. "A couple." She sipped her coffee, eyes darting to the clock. "I have to leave early." "Another late night?" He forced himself to sound curious, not bitter. She paused, the mug halfway to her lips. "Probably. You know how it is?" "Yeah." He set down his spoon. "I know." Elise glanced at him, a flicker of something passing across her face. Annoyance? Fear? Regret? He couldn't tell. She finished her coffee quickly and left with a hurried goodbye, her perfume lingering in the air long after she'd gone. Blake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where she'd stood. Doubt gnawed at him. Was he reading too much into every little thing? Or was this what betrayal felt like? By the third night, Blake couldn't take it anymore. When Elise walked in at 10:30, he was waiting, seated in the armchair, shadows stretching long across the room. She stopped when she saw him, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it with indifference. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning nonchalance. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, watching her closely. She shifted under his gaze. "I'm going to bed." She turned, but he stood quickly. Elise, wait. The desperation in his voice surprised even him. She stopped, one hand gripping the railing. What is it, Blake? She asked, tiredness or something else slipping into her tone. What's going on? He took a step towards her. You're always tired. You're never here. I just want to know if there's something you're not telling me. Her eyes flashed with something, anger, defensiveness, panic. You're imagining things. Work is stressful. That's all. Don't lie to me. His voice was raw. Please. She glared at him, her jaw set. I'm done talking about this. Without another word, she walked upstairs. Blake didn't follow. He sat back down, the weight of silence pressing down on him. Something had broken between them, and he didn't know if it could ever be fixed. That night, Blake barely slept. He tossed and turned, haunted by fragments of conversations, fleeting looks, half-truths. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He would find out the truth, no matter the cost. Blake sat at his kitchen table, the early morning light casting a cold, pale glow across the room. His coffee sat untouched, growing colder by the minute. He drummed his fingers on the table, eyes distant. Alan, the private investigator, was discreet, reliable, and known for being brutally honest. It was exactly what Blake needed and feared. I can get started immediately, Mr. Reeves, Alan had said when they first met. He was a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, dressed in a plain suit that suggested anonymity over style. You'll have answers soon. Blake nodded, barely able to find words. He handed over the initial payment, feeling both dread and a grim sense of relief. Someone else would be uncovering the truth he couldn't face alone. Days stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Every evening, Elise came home later, wearing the same strained smile. The tension between them grew like a shadow creeping across their once bright home. She moved around him carefully, as if afraid of what might spill out if she got too close. Conversations dwindled to mere pleasantries, their intimacy reduced to hollow gestures. Blake felt like a ghost in his own marriage, every moment spent waiting for a call that could shatter everything. That call came early on a Tuesday morning. Blake had just finished buttoning his shirt when his phone buzzed. Seeing Alan's name, he felt his heart drop. He hesitated, then answered, forcing himself to remain calm. Mr. Reeves, you might want to sit down, Alan said, his voice low but steady. Blake's throat tightened. He gripped the edge of the counter. Just tell me. There was a pause, and then, it's exactly what you feared. Your wife is having an affair. The words hit Blake like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he stumbled back against the counter. Who? He whispered, barely able to form the word. Some businessman named Richard. Does the name ring a bell? The air rushed out of Blake's lungs. Richard, the confident executive Elise had met at a networking conference 6 months ago. Blake remembered how she'd spoken about him, how she dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Anger and hurt surged through him. Tell me everything. Alan's voice remained calm as he laid out the details. Meetings at luxury hotels, long dinners, secretive weekend trips. He mentioned photos and videos, each word making Blake's skin crawl. Blake's hands shook. He clenched the phone tighter, wishing he could crush it. Do you want to see the evidence? Alan asked quietly. Blake closed his eyes. The thought of seeing Elise with another man made him want to scream, but he needed the truth. Send it. That night, Blake sat alone in the living room, his laptop glowing in the dark. He opened the folder Alan had sent, each file a dagger aimed at his heart. Photos of Elise and Richard, their hands intertwined, their faces alight with laughter. Videos of stolen moments in hotel lobbies, private dinners, and intimate embraces that left no room for doubt. Blake couldn't breathe. He slammed the laptop shut, rage boiling in his chest. How could she do this? Every memory they'd built together now felt like a lie. He wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, but he also wanted to hide away, to pretend none of this was real. Blake drove aimlessly, his mind racing. He ended up at a park they used to visit, where the air was crisp and the night was quiet. Memories flooded back, happy moments that now felt like cruel jokes. He sat on a bench, staring at nothing, the weight of betrayal crushing him. The woman he loved, the life they'd built, it was all in pieces. His phone buzzed. It was Alan again. "Mr. Reeves, are you all right?" Blake didn't answer right away. He swallowed hard, his voice hollow. "Thank you, Alan. You did your job. If you need anything else—" Alan began, but Blake ended the call. There was nothing else. Just pain, betrayal, and the cold realization that everything had changed. Blake sat in the living room, his jaw clenched and his eyes focused on the door. The sun had long since set, and darkness enveloped the room except for the dim glow of a single lamp. The folder of damning evidence lay on the coffee table, a collection of every lie Elise had told, every betrayal laid bare. Blake felt his pulse hammering in his chest, each beat fueled by a mix of anger, pain, and a desire for closure. The sound of a car door closing snapped him out of his thoughts. He watched from the window as Elise walked toward the house, moving with the same casual air she'd carried every night since the affair began. The sight only deepened the pit in his stomach. The door creaked open, and Elise stepped inside. Her smile faltered when she saw him waiting. "Hey, you're still up?" she said, her voice uncertain. She placed her purse down, avoiding his eyes. Blake rose slowly from the couch. "We need to talk." Elise froze, her eyes darting to the folder. She forced a laugh. "What's this about?" "You're scaring me." Blake picked up the folder, his grip tightening. He held it out, then let it fall onto the coffee table. Photographs spilled out, images of Elise with Richard, locked in embraces that shattered whatever was left of Blake's trust. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stared at the evidence. "You tell me." Blake's voice was cold, each word like a blade. He watched her face pale, her hands shaking as she reached for the photos. "Blake, I can explain." Her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. Blake laughed, a bitter sound that held no mirth. "Explain?" He took a step closer, his eyes blazing with pain. "You've been sneaking around with him behind my back. His voice faltered, his breath hitching. He turned away, unable to look at her. "I don't even want to hear it." Elise's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Blake. It was a mistake. I love you." I was confused. It didn't mean anything. She reached out, but he stepped back, recoiling as if her touch would burn him. "Didn't mean anything?" His voice rose, raw with hurt. "Every lie you told, every night you came home late, every time you looked me in the eyes and pretended everything was fine, that was all meaningless?" She nodded frantically, her tears falling faster. "Yes, it was a terrible mistake. I was lost, but I love you, Blake. I always have." She crawled closer, desperation etched into every line of her face. "We can fix this. We can go back." Blake shook his head, his hands trembling. "Back? To what?" He gestured to the scattered photos. "This? There is no going back." Elise sobbed, her body shaking. "Please. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just don't leave me." She reached for him again, but he moved out of her grasp. He turned away, his heart pounding. The memories of their life together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the plans for the future, all felt tainted. He walked to the counter and picked up a manila envelope. Without looking at her, he placed it on the coffee table. "Those are divorce papers. Sign them." Her eyes widened, the reality of his words sinking in. "No, you can't be serious. Dead serious." Blake's voice was firm, the finality clear. He turned to leave, needing to get away from the woman he no longer recognized. But her next words stopped him cold. "Do you really think your little salary compares?" Her tone shifted, venomous and cutting. She rose to her feet, wiping her tears away with a sudden fierceness. "My rich dad will finish you. He'll make sure you lose everything. You'll regret this, loser. You'll regret leaving me." He paused, disbelief and fury mingling in his eyes. "You're threatening me now?" "It's not a threat, Blake. It's a promise." Her face twisted, the softness from before replaced by a cold, hardened mask. "You think you can just walk away and take half? My father will bury you in court. You'll be nothing." Blake stared at her, the woman he'd once promised to love and protect. Now, She stood before him like a stranger, someone willing to destroy him rather than accept responsibility. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm within him. "You're really that far gone, aren't you?" "I'm fighting for what's mine," she spat, crossing her arms. "You want to end this? Fine. But don't think it'll be easy." Blake's gaze hardened. "You already ended it, Elise. You did this." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy but resolute. "Where are you going?" she demanded, desperation creeping back in her voice. He stopped, hand on the doorknob. "To get out of this nightmare?" Without another word, he walked out, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of what they'd once built. Blake drove through the night, the city lights blurring past. He ended up at the beach, where waves crashed against the shore. He stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. The rage and pain inside him were overwhelming, but as he stared out at the horizon, he made a vow. He wouldn't let her, or her father, destroy him. The fight was far from over, but Blake was ready. The morning sunlight barely crept through the blinds in Blake's small, sparsely decorated apartment. He hadn't slept. The events of the confrontation with Elise played over and over in his mind, a loop of betrayal and venomous threats. His coffee had gone cold on the kitchen counter, untouched. The silence around him felt oppressive, but his thoughts were louder than any noise. The sudden vibration of his phone on the table made him jump. He grabbed it, half expecting another desperate text or call from Elise. Without glancing at the caller ID, he pressed it to his ear. "Hello?" "Reeves," a deep, gravelly voice drawled. Blake's breath caught. He knew that voice too well. Arthur Langford, Elise's father, the man who had made his disdain for Blake no secret from day one. Blake straightened, every muscle in his body tensing. "Arthur." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "What's this nonsense I hear about divorce?" Arthur's tone was cold, condescending. "I warned you, boy. I warned you that you'd never be good enough for her." Blake gritted his teeth. He had always hated the way Arthur spoke to him, as if he were nothing more than a stain on the Langford family name. "Stay out of this," he said, his voice measured but sharp. "This is between me and Elise." Arthur's laughter was cruel. "Is it? You think you could just walk away from my daughter? From this family? Let me make one thing clear. You'll sign whatever papers Elise puts in front of you, and you'll leave quietly. Otherwise," Blake's grip on the phone tightened. "Otherwise what?" "Otherwise," Arthur continued, his voice darkening, "you'll never work in this city again. I have friends in every industry, every boardroom. I'll make one call, and you'll be done. No job, no future. You'll be lucky to scrape by." Blake felt a wave of rage wash over him. He had worked his entire life to build a career, to prove that he was more than the man Arthur sneered at. He clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his composure. "Is that all you have? Threats?" "It's not a threat," Arthur replied smoothly. "It's a promise. Walk away. Let Elise be with someone who can actually provide for her." Blake's blood boiled. "You mean your precious Richard, right? The man she betrayed me with? Is that who you want for your daughter?" There was a pause, a brief silence that hinted at something beneath Arthur's smug facade. Then he spoke, his words laced with disdain. "Richard is a man of means. He can give her what you never could. Status, wealth, power." Blake closed his eyes, trying to block out the bitterness of Arthur's words. "This isn't about status. It's about betrayal." Arthur's tone turned icy. "This is your last warning, Reeves. If you don't step aside, I will ruin you." The line went dead before Blake could respond. He lowered the phone slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The threat lingered in Blake's mind as he paced the apartment. He had known that divorcing Elise would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated a full-scale war. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door, needing to clear his head. The city streets were bustling, life moving forward while his own felt like it was crumbling. He stopped at a small coffee shop, one he used to frequent with Elise during happier times. The memories stung, but he forced himself to stay. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, staring out at the people passing by. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his lawyer, Clara. "Need to discuss strategy. Urgent." Blake stared at the message, his mind racing. Arthur wasn't bluffing. The man would pull every string he had to destroy him. But Blake wasn't about to give up without a fight. He called Clara back. Blake, Clara's voice was brisk but sympathetic. I've heard some rumblings. Arthur Langford is already making moves. Of course he is, Blake muttered, running a hand through his hair. What are we looking at? He's reaching out to your employer. Rumor has it he wants you blackballed from every major firm in the city. Clara's tone hardened. But we can fight this. How? Blake's voice cracked slightly. He hated the vulnerability in it, but the weight of Arthur's power was crushing. The man controls half the city. He'll bury me? Not if we play smart, Clara insisted. We can expose what he's doing. We can gather evidence of his interference and take it public if needed. I'll reach out to contacts, see who's willing to push back. Blake exhaled slowly. Do it? Whatever it takes. He ended the call, feeling a mix of hope and despair. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about his survival. Later that evening, Blake returned home, exhaustion pressing down on him. The phone call from Arthur replayed in his head. Every word, every threat, it all fueled a fire inside him. He poured himself a drink, the burn of the whiskey dulling the edge of his rage. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find a courier standing there, a manila envelope in hand. For Blake Reeves, the man said, handing it over. Blake signed and closed the door, his heart sinking. He knew what it was before he even opened it. Inside, he found legal documents, papers from Arthur's legal team, demanding that he vacate their shared home, relinquish any claims to joint assets, and agree to a swift, uncontested divorce. The terms were brutal, designed to leave him with nothing. He read through the pages, his hands shaking. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Arthur. Walk away, Blake. This is your only chance. Blake stared at the note, the weight of it crushing him. But instead of breaking, something inside him hardened. He grabbed a pen, scribbled a single word across the bottom, and placed the papers back in the envelope. No, he wasn't going to be pushed around. Not by Arthur. Not by Elise. This fight had only just begun. Blake spent the next few months in a haze of calculated moves and quiet determination. The pain of betrayal and Arthur's threats had transformed into something sharper, a resolve to strike back and regain control over his life. He couldn't afford to act rashly. Arthur Langford and Richard were powerful, ruthless, and connected. But Blake knew their strength was also their weakness. The higher they climbed, the harder they'd fall. His first move was to sell the house. It had become a symbol of broken promises and shattered trust. He didn't want it anymore, but he also knew that moving quickly would prevent Arthur and Elise from tying up assets. He met with a real estate agent under a pseudonym, wearing a cap pulled low over his eyes. Fast sale, Blake told the agent, his voice firm. No questions? The agent nodded, sensing the urgency. Within weeks, the house was sold. Blake watched from across the street as the new owners moved in. He felt nothing but relief. Next, he liquidated investments and savings accounts tied to his name. He transferred the funds into anonymous offshore accounts, using connections he'd built over years in finance. Every transaction was cloaked in secrecy. He knew Arthur's reach extended far, but even the most powerful had blind spots. As a final measure, Blake quietly resigned from his job, severing one more tether that could be used against him. By day, Blake appeared to have faded away, a man broken by the weight of divorce and scandal. But by night, he meticulously collected evidence. He hired investigators, not just to dig into Elise and Richard's affair, but to expose every skeleton in their professional closets. It was a painstaking process. He sifted through documents, made discreet calls, and even followed up on rumors that sounded too wild to be true. Late one night, Blake sat at his kitchen table, his laptop glowing dimly. An encrypted folder opened on the screen, revealing emails and financial statements linking Richard to illegal offshore dealings and questionable mergers. Blake's pulse quickened. This was it, proof that Richard wasn't just a philanderer, but a fraud. Bingo, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in months, a flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Gathering the evidence was only part of the plan. He needed to time the release perfectly to cause maximum damage. He enlisted Clara, his lawyer, to ensure everything was airtight. She was hesitant at first, wary of crossing powerful enemies, but Blake's determination and the evidence he provided convinced her. "This is dangerous," Clara warned one evening as they sat in her dimly lit office. "Arthur Langford won't just roll over. You know what he's capable of?" Blake's eyes were cold, devoid of the man she once knew. "I'm counting on it." Clara sighed. "All right, but once we start this, there's no turning back. I'm ready." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Every piece of evidence, every shady deal Richard made, every connection Arthur used to manipulate the system. We hit them hard." The days leading up to the release were tense. Blake moved between safe houses, wary of being followed. He barely slept, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. Then the day came. With Clara's help, they compiled every document, every damning piece of evidence, and released it to trusted media contacts, law enforcement agencies, and regulatory bodies. The fallout was immediate and brutal. News channels erupted with coverage of the scandal, calling it one of the largest financial frauds in recent memory. Richard's name was plastered across every headline, his empire crumbling overnight. Investors pulled out, board members resigned, and lawsuits piled up. He was summoned for questioning by federal authorities, his assets frozen pending investigation. But the damage didn't stop there. Arthur Langford's connection to Richard's illegal dealings became evident. Photos and documents showed him attending secret meetings, pulling strings behind the scenes. Arthur's reputation took a massive hit. His carefully curated image as a business magnate and philanthropist shattered. The stock price of his company plummeted, and his allies distanced themselves, fearing collateral damage. Blake watched it all unfold from a distance. He stood in a small, windowless apartment, the TV glowing in the corner. A reporter detailed the scandal, highlighting the financial ruin facing Richard and Arthur. Sources say this could be just the beginning. Criminal charges may follow. Blake took a sip of whiskey, feeling the burn in his throat. It wasn't joy he felt, more like grim satisfaction. He'd lost everything, but so had they. In the midst of the chaos, Elise called. Blake stared at her name on the screen, debating whether to pick up. Eventually, he pressed accept. "Blake." Her voice was hoarse, desperate. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. "You did this, didn't you?" There was a tremor in her voice. "You ruined everything." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You ruined us, Elise." "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "But you've destroyed lives." Blake closed his eyes, fighting back memories of their life together. "Goodbye, Elise." He ended the call and blocked her number. Arthur was the next to reach out. This time, it was a knock at Blake's door. Blake opened it to find Arthur standing there, disheveled and furious. "You think this is over?" Arthur snarled, stepping inside without invitation. "You think you've won?" Blake met his gaze, unflinching. "Get out." Arthur sneered. "I'll find a way to fix this. I'll bury you." "You already tried that," Blake replied, his voice steady. "Look where it got you." He stepped closer, his expression cold. "This is your mess now. Clean it up." Arthur glared at him, then turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Blake watched him go, knowing this was only the beginning of Arthur's downfall. In the weeks that followed, Blake disappeared. He changed his name, moved to a different city, and started over. He'd lost everything, but he'd reclaimed his freedom. From a distance, he heard about Arthur and Richard's continuing struggles, court battles, financial ruin, public disgrace. Elise, too, was caught in the crossfire, facing a life far removed from the privilege she once took for granted. Blake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift, if only slightly. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think of a future that was his own. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. Blake leaned against the wooden railing of the small cottage he now called home. It was quiet here, nestled deep in the countryside, miles away from the chaos of his old life. Birds chirped as the wind rustled the trees, and for a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. 5 years had passed since Blake had taken his revenge. In that time, he'd rebuilt himself piece by piece. He no longer lived under the shadow of betrayal and vengeance. He worked as a financial consultant, helping small businesses navigate the complexities of their markets. His new career was fulfilling, and it allowed him the freedom he craved. He lived simply, content with the life he'd carved out of the wreckage. As he stood lost in thought, the front door opened, and Grace stepped out. She was carrying a steaming mug of tea, her soft brown hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She smiled when she saw him, a smile that had become his anchor in recent years. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, handing him the mug. Blake took it, savoring the warmth in his hands. "Just thinking about how far I've come," he said, his voice low but steady. Grace leaned against the railing beside him, their shoulders brushing. "I hope it's mostly good memories." "Mostly," Blake replied, turning to look at her. She had an uncanny way of grounding him, of bringing him back to the present when the past threatened to pull him under. He placed a hand over hers. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Grace." "Good thing you won't have to find out." She squeezed his hand. "Come on, dinner's getting cold." That evening, they ate together in the cozy kitchen, laughing over shared stories and silly jokes. It was the kind of normalcy Blake had once thought impossible. As they cleared the table, a soft knock echoed through the house. Blake's brow furrowed. They rarely had visitors. "I'll get it," he said, drying his hands. He opened the door to find a courier standing there, a weathered envelope in hand. "Blake Reeves?" the man asked. Blake nodded, taking the envelope and signing for it. He closed the door and stared at the envelope for a moment. It was thick, its edges frayed. There was no return address. "What is it?" Grace asked, sensing his unease. "I'm not sure." He walked over to the table and slid a finger under the seal, pulling out a handwritten letter. His breath caught when he saw the signature at the bottom. "Elise." He read the letter silently, his heart pounding. The words were desperate, pleading. "Blake, I've lost everything. My father disowned me. Richard is in prison. I have no one. Please, if you have even a shred of compassion left, help me. I was wrong. I know that now. I'm sorry for everything. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it." Blake set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, he stared at it, memories of their life together flashing before his eyes. The good, the bad, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, pity, sadness. But above all, he felt nothing. The weight of her words didn't crush him as they once might have. He was free of her hold. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Who's it from?" she asked gently. "Elise," he said, the name feeling like a distant echo. Grace's eyes softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" Blake shook his head. "Not really." He picked up the letter and walked to a drawer, placing it inside. He closed it with finality. "It's over." "Are you sure?" Grace asked, concern etched on her face. "Yeah," Blake replied, turning to face her. "I've moved on. She's just a ghost now." The following day, Blake went about his routine. He worked on financial reports, took a walk through the fields, and shared lunch with Grace. But Elise's letter lingered at the edge of his mind. He found himself wondering what had become of her. He'd heard bits and pieces over the years, rumors of her father's fall from grace, whispers of Richard's arrest, but he'd never bothered to confirm any of it. It wasn't his concern. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Grace, sipping wine and watching the stars, she broke the comfortable silence. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" he asked, turning to her. "Not helping her." Grace's eyes were thoughtful. "She's asking for compassion, Blake." He considered her words carefully. "She made her choices," he said finally. "And I made mine. I gave her everything once. She threw it away." Grace nodded, but there was no judgment in her eyes. "Just remember that forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you." Blake stared at the stars, letting her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe holding on to old grudges would only weigh him down. But forgiving Elise didn't mean letting her back into his life. It meant letting go of the power she once held over him. He reached for Grace's hand, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Days turned into weeks, and Blake focused on the life he'd built. He never replied to Elise's letter. He didn't need to. He had nothing left to say. One afternoon, as he walked through the bustling market with Grace, he realized that the echoes of the past no longer haunted him. They were just that, echoes, fading with each step forward. "You okay?" Grace asked, noticing the faraway look in his eyes. "I am," Blake said, smiling at her. "I really am." They continued walking hand in hand, the noise of the market fading into the background. Blake had found peace, and nothing, not even the ghosts of his past, could take that away from him.